I've seen at the Home Office things that most people haven't seen. I've seen the fact that we can't remove foreign national offenders like rapists and murderers because of our membership of the ECHR. I've seen that there are dozens of terror suspects on our streets today who we cannot survey properly and remove because of the ECHR. And I've obviously seen that we weren't able to implement Rwanda in a sufficiently strong and robust manner because of the ECHR. So if we can explain that to the public, I think we can win the argument. And then when we re-enter government, we can actually get this job done and secure our borders.
I'm Ben Houchin. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. So today's guest is Robert Jenrick. He is the MP for Newark, first elected in 2014. He's held some very high-profile positions within the Conservative government, housing, communities and local government Secretary of State. He was also Minister for Immigration and has been a huge advocate of things like free ports, housing reform, levelling up, and most recently has been, I would suggest, quite a big critic of the government's immigration plans. So thank you for joining us today, Robert.
Good to be here, Ben.
Now, the thing you're also here for is the fact that you're a leadership contender as well in the upcoming leadership election for the Conservative Party. And this is one of the platforms, given that this is a podcast in partnership with Con Home, to get your message across, not just to MPs, but to members as we go through this process. And, you know, I've just given you a very brief overview of what has been a very long and illustrious career. It's been 10 years, doesn't feel like 10 years. I remember when I came up and campaigned for you in the Newark by-election, which feels like yesterday, but also a lifetime ago.
Yeah,
as well.
I can't believe that 10 years have passed since then. I've got a few more grey hairs since then. When I was first elected, I'll tell you a story. I was sworn in front of the whole House of Commons, because in a by-election, you're just a class of one.
That's right, yeah.
And it was very hushed after PMQs. So it was David Cameron and it must have been Ed Miliband sat there. And I bowed before the dispatch boxes, as you have to do. And then there was a heckle from across the chamber, and it was the Beast of Bolsover, now departed from the House of Commons. And he said, "Is he here on work experience?" And everyone burst out laughing. Anyway, I think I've moved on from that now.
You've fulfilled your apprenticeship.
Exactly.
You're looking to move on to kind of senior statesman. So no, I mean, like I say, I think lots of people will be familiar with the political background, but I suspect lots of people are not as familiar with your life before politics. You know, where you grew up, what you were doing before politics, which I think is important to people. People want to know that their politicians are well-rounded individuals and have had a life outside of politics. So, you know, share with the listeners of the Blueprint Podcast exactly what you did before you get into politics.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Wolverhampton in the Black Country. My dad was from Manchester. My mum was from Liverpool. My mum was a secretary. He used to work at Littlewoods in Liverpool. And then my dad was a gas fitter. They both left school 16. My dad was an apprentice. They moved to Bilston, just outside Wolverhampton, and then ultimately just outside Wolverhampton into Shropshire. And so I grew up there. My mum and dad set up a small business around our kitchen table.
What was that?
It was making gas fires and fitting them. In fact, they later moved to Newton Aycliffe.
I remember we talked about this a few years ago, actually, just outside of my patch.
Yeah.
Are they still there?
They have a small manufacturing business there. So I knew a bit about the North East from a young age because my dad used to drive up to Newton Aycliffe every week. But I guess my politics was forged from that period because they were working class people who had been given the self-confidence to quit their jobs, take a big risk because they didn't have a lot of money, and set up a small business literally round our kitchen table. My dad trained to be a gas fitter so he could fit the fires himself and drove the white van, and he was cutting marble and assembling things in our garage. And it was because of Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government of the 1980s that I think they had the confidence to take that step and to become business people, small business people. And it was also actually their experience of working in factories and businesses in the 60s and 70s and watching out-of-control trade unions, bad management, wreck great British businesses, that they also felt that socialism and the Labour Party was the wrong course, had let the country down during that period.
Were they quite political, your parents, then? Or?
They were not political.
Yep.
I mean, they were not members of political parties. I think my mum was a Conservative. My dad definitely didn't vote Conservative until I stood for Parliament in 2010.
Oh, really?
And I think that was out of sympathy for me that he voted Conservative. But funnily enough, despite that, my dad would always say that he thought that Margaret Thatcher had saved the country from socialism. And I think with hindsight, looked back on the change, the revolution that she brought to the country in terms of making us a more enterprising place, taking us out of the dark period of the 1970s with huge admiration. And it was their values which really shaped my political views, which was about self-reliance, family, small business, free enterprise, opportunity, aspiration, and drove me ultimately to go into politics myself.
Do you think it was more their influence because of their experience in the 70s and 80s and that huge contrast that kind of imprinted itself upon you? Because the reason I ask is you're only a handful of years older than I am. And I say to people, well, I was too young to really remember the Margaret Thatcher years. I know what I've read and I've looked back on it. But Margaret Thatcher herself didn't really shape my politics. Is it fair to say that directly, it doesn't sound like she shaped your politics either?
No, I think she did. I mean, it was fair to say I don't remember that period. Yeah. I was born in 1982. The first election I remember was the 92 election. Even that was dimly. I joined the Conservative Party in 1997 when I was 16 or just afterwards in Wolverhampton. But I do think it was. I was definitely imbued by my parents by the huge contrast between the post-war period when both Conservative and Labour governments accepted a status quo which led to national decline and culminated in the late 1970s, which had imprinted itself upon them so sharply. You've got to remember my dad was someone who had worked at the Ford factory in Dagenham, whose first job was an apprentice in Trafford Park in Manchester, which at the time there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I think, people, huge number of people who were employed there and in big, old, heavy industry. And all of those businesses had then been racked by the trade unions, by bad management, and had been in terminal decline. And then the Thatcher government came along and transformed the prospects for the whole country. And that was something, although I was growing up, in the 90s, really, which was the post-Thatcher period, that did imprint itself upon me and has shaped my politics as well. I mean, I think the other thing that my childhood imprinted upon me was the fact that, I didn't grow up in London. I only went to London a couple of times before I was 18. I think we went to visit a museum on a school trip, and my mum and dad saved up and took us to see a show, I think, once in London. But so my childhood was in the Midlands and the North. So we'd go and visit my grandparents in Manchester and Liverpool, and it was, I guess, quite provincial. We'd go into Birmingham every now and again, but generally speaking, life was small towns. It was what people would disparagingly call provincial Britain.
It sounds very familiar.
And it's similar probably to your upbringing.
I didn't go to London until I was an adult as well. And it's
and I don't say that with any, I'm not ashamed of that. That was just life. And that is also the life of millions of people in our country. I mean, I now represent a small town in North Nottinghamshire, and I organise monthly coach trips down to Parliament for my constituents.
Of course.
And it's perfectly normal to have people on those coach trips who've never been to London, who've taken the opportunity. We do these sort of cheap £20 coach trips. And so, I'm unashamedly provincial. And I do think even more so now that the Conservative Party's job is to be the trade union for working people, for provincial Britain. We should be standing up for the values of those people who are our people. And every decision we take, whether it's on tax or public services or immigration, we should be seeing the world through the lens of their lives. How do we make their lives better? How do we help them to get on the housing ladder? How can we help them to keep more money in their pocket? How can we defend the values that they care about, whether that's patriotism or a sense of national unity at a time when the pace of change is so fast in our country with immigration at the pace that it's been in recent years? That is essentially my politics, and that has become more and more apparent to me, as I've represented a small town in North Nottinghamshire and seen the things that have been happening in recent years and the work that you've done in the North East. I think you and I share a lot in the sense that We want to represent these communities. We want the Conservative Party to be relevant to people who live in these places.
And I was going to come on to that. So, I mean, you get a very clear sense from listening to exactly what it is to be a Conservative and what your Conservative values are. But particularly picking up on some of the roles that you've had in government, but also now looking towards the leadership election as well. How do you think that is going to shape your kind of decision-making and policy? Because it feels to me, and I think it's probably fair to say, we as a party have kind of lost our way and have detached ourselves from some of those core values that we all recognise.
I think that's right. I mean, the thing that pained me most at the general election was knocking on doors and people saying to me, I don't know what your party stands for. And I want to change that.
Do you know what we stood for at the election?
Well, I know what I stood for, and I know that I would not have got elected if I hadn't tried to work hard for my constituents and didn't have distinctive views, particularly on things like immigration, which chimed with my constituents, and I would argue millions of people, most people across our country. But, I'm the only Conservative MP in the whole of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. I'm the designated survivor of the East Midlands, and you have Matt Vickers in Teesside, the designated survivor of the North East. So, what I want to do is to reconnect the Conservative Party with what I would argue are its enduring values and principles, so that at the next election, you put on a blue rosette, people know exactly what it stands for. And we have pride in wearing it. Somebody opens the door to us and they know exactly what it stands for and want to vote for it. That's going to mean us thinking carefully about what the party believes in. What is our purpose? Because, of course, we want unity as a party. Yeah. That's critical because there's been all this factionalism and division that's been very damaging to our brand. But the essential foundation of unity is that the party is clear about what it believes in and has a sense of purpose and mission. It has not had that in recent years. I set out in the Sunday Telegraph a few weekends ago what I think are the 10 principles of conservatism, not as the sort of 10 commandments that everyone has to sign up to. There's no single individual has a monopoly on wisdom on what our party stands for. But I do think we have to have a debate now in the party about what we believe in, then unite around that. And anyone who wants to stand to be a councillor, an elected mayor, a member of parliament should subscribe to a set of common values. And the reason I say that is that when you do get into government, and we are fortunate enough to re-enter government in the future, if you don't have a core set of values, then it's so easy to get knocked off course by events, by the civil service, by the media. And I think that is what happened in recent years. We ended up as an indistinguishable technocratic party where we were taking decisions which are really at odds with our fundamental beliefs. And that led to us not delivering for the British public. And that was the real reason why we lost, because we just simply didn't deliver on the things that we said we were going to do. And the three most prominent of those to me are on immigration, where we said we were going to control and reduce immigration, secure our border. We did precisely the opposite. That was why I resigned from cabinet, because I fought relentlessly to get reforms to our immigration system, secured many, but when I couldn't get enough, I chose to leave. I thought that was the honourable thing to do. On the economy, we said we'd deliver a strong economy, but the truth is that growth was too low, taxes were too high, and we did lose our reputation for sound management of the public finances, particularly in the events of the autumn of 2022. And then on public services, people want a strong NHS, but yet 1 in 10 of us are on an NHS waiting list. I think that the state got bigger, but not better. And I want a small state that works, not a big state that fails. So I think we have to rediscover our principles so that we can actually deliver again the next time we're in government.
So we're going to come on to some of the policy in a bit more detail, and all of those things you've talked about. I think the listeners of the Blueprint podcast are going to want to know more about your stance on that. But if we rewind a little bit to what you were saying about what we stand for, you want to stand for the leadership, you want to be the leader of this party, and you're right, we need to have an open debate about what the future of the Conservative Party is. We need to bring everybody together, create that unity. But leadership is also about leading people as well. So if you were able to fast forward, and I appreciate this conversation needs to kind of happen within the Conservative family, but if you could fast forward and knock on the door at the next election and you're the leader of the Conservative Party, what do you want the person on the doorstep to be able to say when you ask them, what does the Conservative Party stand for under Robert Jenrick?
Well, look, the things that I would hope that they would know about me and a party that I would lead is that we believe in the nation state as the essential foundation of our country, that we believe that our people and Parliament are sovereign, and that to do that, that means taking steps like leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, that if you come here illegally, you'll be detained and deported, not within months and years, but within hours and days, that we believe in the family, and that we will do everything we can to help people to have kids, to put down roots, to get going in life, that we want to help young people to get on the housing ladder, because you've got to have a stake in society, and we are the party of home ownership. We cannot live in a world in which young people are stuck in their childhood bedrooms waiting for their lives to begin. That we believe in small business and free enterprise, and that we will try to reduce taxes, try to make it easier for people to be entrepreneurs, whether that's in the big, fast-growing industries of the future like tech and AI and life sciences, or it's the hundreds of thousands of sole traders and white van men and women who live in places like I represent in North Nottinghamshire, and there's a very large number in the North East. And that we believe in strong defences, very tough on crime and law and order. These are the policies which I want us to be putting out. I also think that beyond those, the party has to be a professional and competent force that people can believe is worthy of being in office. And too many people in our country felt that the Conservative Party was so riven with division, was so poor at delivering things, that it just wasn't suitable to be in office. And so I hope that I can have a clearly Conservative agenda, but one which is presented in a manner which seems obviously professional and competent, so that people can place their trust in us once again.
So one of the things, and I know we've talked about this previously, is to be able to demonstrate that unity, to be able to get that person on the doorstep to understand what we stand for as a party is something that's essential to winning the next election. But it's a very difficult thing to do in opposition, because you're not actually in charge of delivering anything. So the idea that you can deliver competent public service reform, or you can deliver lower taxes, how do we do that? How do you think we can do that in opposition? It's obviously part of your leadership bid. What do we do to be able to get people on board with that?
Well, there's a few things I'd say. Firstly, the only proxy we have for how we would behave when we were in government is how we now behave in opposition, and in particular how the leader, the shadow cabinet and the parliamentary party behave, because it's we in Westminster who've let down the party. It's not you. We've seen how well you've performed as mayor, and that's evidenced by the fact you managed to get re-elected time and again, and this most recent election against all the odds. So we have to behave in a more professional manner. We've got to ditch the factionalism and the division and the briefing and so on. I do think that does not just come about in and of itself. You can't just wish that to happen.
Yep.
It comes about through having a sense of purpose. That is why I do think it's critical to think through what the party stands for and unite around that, not just hoping that we'll become a more united force. I also think you have to engage with the big issues facing the country. Of course, we are 4 or 5 years away from the next general election. We don't know precisely what shape the country is going to be in then. So there is an argument not to tie yourself down too quickly. But if we want to be a serious party, we have to be engaging in the serious challenges facing our country right now. And those are, to my mind, how do you get real growth growing in the economy after a long period of low growth, low productivity? How do you tackle this age of mass migration that is putting so much strain on public services and unity and community cohesion? How do you get public services to actually perform? The state is not working well for British people right now. There are many other issues, but I think you have to engage in those issues and begin, slowly but surely, to be forming serious answers to the serious challenges facing the country. And contrast that, I think, with a Labour Party which does not appear to have a plan for the country. You've got a Labour Party that has been in opposition for 14 years, had so long to think about what it wants to do to tackle the big problems our country undoubtedly faces, and yet is scrabbling around creating new quangos like Great British Energy, National Wealth Fund, etc., creating reviews and commissions, doing incredibly minor things like, we hear today as we're recording this that Keir Starmer is thinking about banning people from smoking outdoors at pubs and clubs and so on. These are not the priorities of this country. So if you've got an opposition where they've been elected on a mandate to change the country. There is a yearning in our country for serious government and reform, and yet they are not stepping up to that. Their ideas are so stale for a government that is so fresh. We have to step into that space. I don't think it will be easy. I think we have to acknowledge that there is a mountain to climb,
does it create difficulty?
But we can do it.
Does it create difficulty with party unity? Because one of the things I see, and this is just a personal opinion, I see a parliamentary party that is a very different parliamentary party to the one we had before the general election. It feels kind of much more, I don't know, I'm going to get this wrong, but much more centrist than maybe it was before the 2024 election. But we have a membership, and again, I'm playing devil's advocate slightly here, but people stereotypically kind of feel is much more right-wing than necessarily the representation within Parliament. And unity isn't necessarily just about the parliamentary party, it's about the party as a whole. And how do you think, do you think that proposition I put forward is right? Do you think that the membership could potentially find itself at loggerheads with the parliamentary party? And therefore, how do we bring those people together? Because we've got to bring the whole Conservative family along with us, not just the parliamentary party.
Well, look, I think it's possible to bring that together. Look, I'm somebody who, I think uniquely in this leadership contest, served in each of the last 5 Conservative Prime Ministers' governments. They're very different people, sometimes with different agendas, to say the least. So I think I can be a bridge between different parts of our party. I don't think some of these issues are crudely about left or right. I think that an issue like immigration, for example, is an issue which is the common ground in British politics. It is one where millions of people agree. And that doesn't matter whether you live in Stockton or you live in Surrey. People are worried about these issues. They want to hear Conservatives coming forward with answers to them. I do think the way we talk about these things matters. And I believe in persuading, not provoking, in choosing our language with a degree of subtlety and care, so we can appeal to people who might be a bit more robust, like my constituents in North Nottinghamshire, as well as people in other parts of the country who might have more liberal sentiments. And I understand that and appreciate that. So we have to choose language that works for the whole country and aspire to represent the whole of the United Kingdom. But I don't think we should think that these issues don't matter.
Yeah.
Well, everyone in our country ultimately wants secure borders.
They do.
They want to be tough on crime.
And it's not, you're right, it's not a left and right thing, because, there are lots of people in this country that I speak to and you see out and about who aren't interested in politics and aren't of the Conservative Party or the left and not into the Labour Party.
Very few people define themselves.
Exactly.
Who on the doorstep do you talk to who says I'm right wing or, you do hear a few people who say they're left wing. But, most people are not like that. Most people have, a range of views. And we just have to be on the common ground of British politics, trying to find what the silent majority of our country believes in and trying to support them through that. I do think it requires leadership, and the parliamentary party, in my experience, responds to a clear sense of mission because we want to win. We want to get back into power. There's an incredible sense of impotence being in opposition. And if we can instill the parliamentary party with a sense that we are now going to be a team, we're going to work together, everyone is going to be included in this mission, and this is how we're going to get back. I think that people will get on board and will work together through that. I also think that even on some of the issues that are crudely characterised as on the right, like immigration, we have no choice as a party but to tackle those, not just because the public care about them, because we're also now in a political bind, that there is an existential battle going on for who is the standard bearer of the right of British politics. And if we don't win that battle, bring back the millions of people that we've lost to reform, then it's very hard to see an immediate future for the Conservative Party. And the great benefit of doing that, of getting migration done as an issue, if you like, is that we can move on to talk about all the other things that we care about, which the rest of the country, in fact, well, you and I didn't go into politics 10 years ago to primarily talk about immigration. The things that motivate me are, how do we get better quality jobs? How do we raise living standards? How do we improve skills for our kids? I created a free school in my constituency because I was worried about low aspiration. The environment, the country, you name it. There are many other things. But if we don't settle this issue of migration, we won't win ourselves the space to move on to talk about all the things that will win back the millions of voters we lost to the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, and that's what I want to do.
And I think, so if we move on to kind of the policy piece now, and you've touched upon it a few times, so let's just deal with the immigration stuff so we can talk about the other topics which are arguably more important if we can, like you say, put the immigration bit to bed. You were the Minister for Immigration. It's fairly obvious that it was quite high profile and it's quite a big deal when you resigned from government. What led you to that decision? Because ultimately, in a very simplistic way, it led people to believe that the government's plan, particularly around Rwanda and the deportation of failed asylum seekers and people who didn't get leave to remain, was in effect a failed policy. So what led you to that decision, and how is that influencing your leadership bid in relation to an immigration policy?
Well, I came to see that both legal and illegal migration were incredibly important to the country, because the basic function, the basic duty of the state is to secure its borders and to keep the public safe. And we were not doing that. And it wasn't just this last Conservative government, it was basically all the governments of my adult lifetime. And it was both bad for the country, because on legal migration, it was leading to massive pressure on housing, on public services. I think it was making us poorer, because I think bringing in very large number of people from overseas was suppressing the wages of British workers, particularly working class people.
That's something that particularly, many in the mainstream media, but also on the left of politics, just rally against this idea that immigration, particularly low-skilled immigration, it's a big part of the European question, right? Which is why I was a Brexiteer. I looked at a place like Teesside, and you did see low-skilled immigration that was suppressing wages of semi-skilled as well as skilled trades, which was depressing communities, right? It was keeping...
Yeah, I saw that in my constituency, where our biggest employers are distribution centres, food processing businesses, and some of them have barely changed in the 10 years I've known them. They haven't embraced technology to automate. They're not investing massively in the skills of their workforce because they know they can bring people in from overseas, and that means that the wages of those people are the living wage or just above it, not what they should be.
If you speak to some of the other contenders in the leadership contest, they have a couple of them have a view that actually the laws and the statutes that have been put in place allowed us to be able to get hold of immigration and deport people. Now, I find that quite surprising because we didn't see that. Is that something, you as the immigration minister, did you see that the right legislation's in place, or do you think that the legislation is defective in allowing us to be able to get hold of this immigration question?
Well, look, by leaving the EU and ending freedom of movement, it is certainly true that for the first time in my lifetime, we gained control of the levers of migration. So ministers now have within their hands the ability to make a better immigration system. But then the ministers at the time used those in the worst possible way to develop a system which was even more liberal than the one we had when we were in the EU. And
how so?
Well, I'll give you the examples. They brought back the graduate route that even David Cameron and Nick Clegg had scrapped when we were in the early days of the coalition government. That led to a very large number of foreign students coming in and their dependents, often doing low-value degrees that were more about immigration than they were education. We reduced the salary threshold for coming into the country, so it was at a lower level rather than being about truly high-skilled people by any normal definition of the word. We created a huge shortage occupation list, which grew and grew and grew, and include florists and career advisors and things that did not seem as if they were absolutely mission-critical to the British economy, and we couldn't find amongst our own ranks. We created a health and social care visa that was supposed to bring in under 10,000 people. In the end, 400,000 people came, including a lot of dependents. And that meant that instead of paying a care worker in Teesside £1 an hour extra in order to motivate somebody to stay in that admittedly difficult line of business, somebody would come in from Southeast Asia with their kids who didn't have a home, didn't have a school place and so on, and was ultimately a false economy. So I think those decisions were, they weren't just bad policy decisions. I think it was sticking two fingers up to the electorate, because the electorate had voted in the Brexit referendum for controlled and reduced migration, and the Conservative government at that time created a system that was the opposite of that. And that was immensely damaging to our reputation for competence and honesty, and for trust in politics more generally, because millions of people in our country thought that politicians in Westminster just did not care and would not keep their promises. And
which goes back to the point of competence as well.
It does. And ultimately that, I fought for changes to the system, secured them in the end, which will halve the number of people coming into our country legally, although I see that as the beginning, not the end of the story, because I want to bring it down to the tens of thousands or lower. And on illegal migration, the Rwanda policy that the Prime Minister at the time proposed was simply not going to work. Right. I believe that you need a deterrent, like Rwanda, but it needs to be strengthened. And the proposal that came forward was obviously it wasn't going to work. And so it has proven, because, I'll give you the stat. The scheme that ended up going forward, because the government ignored the amendments that I proposed with 60 of our colleagues, about 1,000 illegal migrants were rounded up by the Home Office who were living in the communities across the country, taken into custody with a view to being deported. When Yvette Cooper walked into the Home Office day after the election, she says only 2 of those people were still in custody. Everyone else had been released by immigration judges because there was a myriad of legal cases ongoing around them. Exactly the case that I argued at the turn of the year. So, that policy was not going to work.
So, but you also say, again, just playing devil's advocate here, that the policies we put in place post-Brexit were not the right policies and actually were arguably more liberal than when we were in the European Union. But you've also been very clear that your position is that we need to leave the ECHR. So is it that the policies were never going to work because of the ECHR, or is the ECHR what you think is a quick fix to dealing with immigration? I mean, I think listeners of the Blueprint podcast would like to understand the nuance between the control that we took back during Brexit and the impact of the ECHR.
Well, legal migration is now within our hands. And so we could do that whether we are party to the ECHR or not. And the deep frustration I have there is it is so simple to make these changes. I mean, Neil O'Brien, a fellow member of Parliament, and I wrote a report earlier in the year where we set out what you need to do. It doesn't even require primary legislation. It could have been,
any of the listeners listening to this haven't
so
read
quickly
the paper between Robert Jenrick and Neil O'Brien, I would absolutely encourage people to read it, because it does set out very, very clearly some of the quick wins that just seemed, when I read it, blindingly obvious that we could have done very, very quickly.
That's right. But on illegal migration, I think it is very hard to control your borders in the modern era whilst remaining within the European Convention on Human Rights.
Think it's possible? You say hard, but do you think it's still?
I think it's impossible.
Right.
I think it's impossible to do because everything that I wanted to do rubs up against these contested notions of international law. And my starting point is this. I will never elevate contested notions of international law over the interests of the British public. I think controlling our borders matters to people. You don't really have a country at all if you don't have secure borders. And the harm that illegal migration is causing, particularly to our poorest communities, because it's not the kids of most politicians who are stuck on social housing waiting lists because they're being bumped down because of illegal migrants. Most politicians or members of the media don't live next door to an asylum hotel or an HMO where asylum seekers are being housed. They're not living in communities which are now divided, where there's intercommunal violence and riots. So they don't really see this. This is like a low-status issue to them. But I don't think we will ever fix that whilst we remain within the ECHR. So I advocate that we leave. I don't think it's reformable. Some people say, well, let's reform it. I think that would take decades and probably be as likely to fail as David Cameron's, well-meant but ill-fated attempt to renegotiate our relationship with the EU. And I don't think the public will wait decades.
No.
This is urgent. And if we are able to re-enter government, we will not be given a third chance. So we would have to fix this. And so I think let's just be clear. Let's say we're going to leave. Let's set out to persuade the public of the case for that. And I appreciate that that is a case that needs to be made to the public. And I don't come at this from an ideological perspective. I come from a practical one, that I've seen at the Home Office things that most people haven't seen. I've seen the fact that we can't remove foreign national offenders like rapists and murderers because of our membership of the ECHR. I've seen that there are dozens of terror suspects on our streets today who we cannot survey properly and remove because of the ECHR. And I've obviously seen that we weren't able to implement Rwanda in a sufficiently strong and robust manner because of the ECHR. So if we can explain that to the public, I think we can win the argument. And then when we re-enter government, we can actually get this job done and secure our borders.
I mean, moving on, because we can talk about immigration all day, and sadly it is the single biggest topic, I think, for the public at the moment. So you're absolutely right. I don't think we can leave this 4 or 5 years to have a policy. We have to engage with it day one. I would argue as big a mission for any government, but arguably a bigger mission personally, is that of levelling up. Yep. I think Kevin Hollinrake came up with the statistic that I stole from him, who's the MP for Thurston Malton, and he said, and it is true to say, that the relative gap in GDP between the north of England and the south of England is greater than that of East and West Germany at the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, that is the task that any government needs to be able to tackle. It feels to me like the Boris Johnson government really tapped into a stream of thinking across the country that a politician or a government hadn't done for many, many decades. But I think it's fair to say that we didn't fulfil our promise, a little bit like immigration, in the way that we did to the public when we made that promise in 2019. You know, you're like me, you're not from the big metropolitan areas. We're from these provincial towns. We've seen what things like Brexit and what the lack of investment for many generations has been in places like ours. And again, it's not just the north of England, actually, which is why Boris quite cleverly talks about levelling up rather than the northern powerhouse. You know, how important is levelling up to you, and how important and what kind of level of priority will levelling up be given in a Robert Jenrick Conservative Party?
Well, everything you say resonates with me. I think it's incredibly important. I still believe that Boris's sentiment was right. You know, opportunity is not spread evenly across our country, but talent is. And I want, a young guy like me growing up in Wolverhampton to have access to all the opportunities that somebody would do if they were growing up in London or one of our other great metropolitan cities, just as I'm sure you do for, your family in the Northeast. And so we mustn't lose levelling up. Now, we can call it something else.
Would you call it something else?
I think we probably need to give it a new lease of life.
Have you come up with what that might be yet?
I haven't yet. But I'll let you know when I do. Or maybe you can come up with it.
Maybe we can.
Maybe we can do it together. But no, I think whatever we choose to describe it as, it's the same mission, isn't it? Yeah. Which is to spread opportunity, and to do that through transport investment, skills investment, pride of place, so that we make sure that our town centres and smaller city centres look and feel like vibrant places once again.
Does that become more of a... Because what we saw with the end of the last Conservative government, really, it became kind of handing out of small capital pots, and it was kind of badged that that's levelling up. Spending £2 or £3 million on, Grimsby High Street was seen as levelling up. But to me, some of the fundamental economics of the regions of the UK, the causes of those economic weaknesses weren't necessarily being addressed. I think Boris got it, but once Boris left, that kind of mission kind of faded. How do we start to try and address some of the fundamental economics of the regions that allows, rather than it just being a handout of here's a few £1 million to some of the less fortunate areas of the country that haven't had the investment?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I take my share of responsibility for that, because I created lots of these funds, like the High Street Fund, the Towns Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, and I don't resile from that, because some of those places had never received
any money. Absolutely,
and so if you're, Stockton or Hereford or Grantham or wherever it is, to get 10 or 20 million pounds of capital investment, was unheard of. And trust me, when I created those funds, the civil servants were not in favour of them. They thought that, you should be pouring money into Liverpool and Newcastle and Manchester and so on, not into these small towns.
Kind of reinforcing the successful areas.
Exactly, yeah. And there was an economic argument that the big drivers of growth are our cities. But I also believe we should stand for small town Britain as well. But you're right to say that isn't enough, and that you've got to have a bigger vision as to how you get the economy firing on all cylinders in these places. And that is about transport, infrastructure investment, and I want us to think carefully about what is the future of some of those larger projects, which we didn't deliver at anything like the extent or ambition that we initially set out to in the early days of the Boris
people
administration.
Also forget that right in the middle of all of this, there was a global pandemic.
There was. I think a lot of the story of levelling up was the scale of the ambition was set back by both the intensity of effort in dealing with COVID and the cost of dealing with COVID that meant it's much more difficult to do some of the things that we initially wanted to do. But I also think we did go about it in too statist a way, because the real issue in places like I represent and the North is we just need more private businesses. The density of private businesses in the Northeast is significantly less than in the Southeast of England.
Absolutely.
So we've got to find ways of getting more businesses, helping people to set up business, to scale those businesses up, get more private investment into all parts of the country. And that, I think, is a more conservative way of looking at this. We did do some of those things, like your Freeport was a prime example of that.
You helped deliver, so thank you very much.
In a small way, but I signed it off. But you you're the genesis of it. But that was looking back to say the enterprise zones and the sort of spurs for growth that came from the Thatcher government in the 1980s, and thinking how can we revive these in a modern way in the 21st century and bring investment, private sector investment, to communities. And that's probably where I'm most interested now. What can we do to harness the power of the private sector to be investing in parts of the country where they're not ordinarily doing that?
And I think, just before we wind up, one of the things that's come up, and one of the startling statistics I saw after the general election, was the average age of the Conservative voter, I think, was 63 in the 2024 election. And if you contrast that just to 2019, I think it was 41.
39.
Is it 39? Well, there you go. That's why you're running for the leadership and I'm not. It feels to me like nobody really has grasped the nettle of what are we offering people who aren't of pensionable age, or certainly over the age of 50. Why would somebody want to know what we stand for, but why would a 20-something or 30-something man or woman want to vote for the Conservative Party? What's our future offer, and how does the Conservative Party speak to those people? Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we've said it's existential for a long time, the need to attract younger people, but now it really is. There's even a stat, which is that 1 in 6 of our voters won't be alive at the next election. Which is a hard one to deliver to some audiences. I tend to lose my audience when I say that sometimes. But on a serious note, we've got to change that. I think there's a few things we've got to do. Most important, because young people aren't fools, is we've got to come up with a compelling vision as to why it is in their interest to vote Conservative. And that is, when we're thinking about cutting taxes for working age people primarily, rather than the asset rich. Thinking about how we can make life easier for people to have a family, like how can we make it cheaper and more affordable to get childcare. And it is about housing. And I think that is such an important topic for us as a party to grapple with, because we know it's contentious, particularly in some parts of the country. As Housing Secretary, I brought housing starts up to the highest level for 40 years, and I'm proud of that. But we're not widely viewed today as the party of housing and home ownership, and we've got to ensure that we regain that mantle. I think we should be doing that primarily in our cities and in areas where there are legions of brownfield land, and we can do that with radical supply side reforms of the kind that I proposed a few years ago. But we also have to strike the right balance to protect the green belts and beautiful parts of the country in a way that perhaps we didn't at some stages when we were in government. So we've got to strike the right balance. But what I don't want the party to do is to retreat into language which sounds like we are anti-housing, anti-development, because that will make it hard for us to be a party of growth and business, and it will make us alienate further young people just at the moment that we should be bringing them back to us. And the good news, Ben, is that across Europe, Canada, the United States, parts of the centre-right are attracting young people. Look at the Canadian Conservatives. They are beating super woke Justin Trudeau with people in their 20s and 30s. And a big part of that is saying we're going to build homes, we're going to get young people onto the housing ladder. So that would be a key building block of my pitch to the country if I was lucky enough to be leader of the party. The Canadian Pierre of the UK, Robert Jenrick. Well, that's been absolutely fascinating, Robert. Really appreciate you coming on. Good luck with the leadership campaign. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. We'll see you again soon. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday wherever you get your usual podcasts from.